Okay. Hey, this first unit of um, wildlife studies, I'd like to take some time to kind of talk about how we got to the point that we're at in regards to the ecosystems and wildlife in the United States. And kind of this first week, we're going to focus on the history of conservation. So, kind of today, we'll start way back, like in the Pleistocene era, and then we'll eventually get up to modern times here. All right. So, here's a look at two famous people that we're eventually going to be talking about. That is, let's see, that's Teddy Roosevelt on the left, and I believe that's John Muir on the right there. Like I said, our goal is to talk about kind of the history of wildlife conservation. We're going to describe any national policies that have impacted it, identify historical people, the values of wildlife, and really, like I said, talk about how we got to where we're at today. We're going to start way back, all right, way back in the Pleistocene era. So 2.5 million years ago to about 11,000 years ago. So until this last kind of break in the ice age. And we're going to look at some of the giant mammals, the giant vertebrates that existed on the landscapes around the world that are no longer present. Okay, this was home to things like the woolly mammoth at the time was numerous, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears. You see how tall that thing is compared to a normal standing human. Teratorns, these gigantic birds. Giant bison were around. Essentially, all these different, megafauna, they'd call them, just dominated the landscape. And the question is, what happened to all these things? Okay, what was it that caused their disappearance? And the biggest thing is human beings. Kind of once that last ice age started to slow down, this relatively new species on the planet really started to multiply and spread and proliferate throughout the countryside, and they're really efficient hunters. Right? You might not know this about humans, but we're maybe not the fastest, we're not the strongest, but we're very smart, and we're actually incredible distance runners, incredible endurance athletes. And so, what tribes of peoples from around the world would do is they would essentially chase these megafauna um, to the point of exhaustion, to the point of the woolly mammoth was too exhausted to move on and would collapse, and then the hunters would move in, or they would participate in things like this. This would be a depiction of a buffalo jump, or where they would, as a tribe, work together to spook a herd of these mammals off of a cliff, off of a pit, in order to maximize the spoils of the hunt there. Okay, here's a real life picture of one. I believe this is out of maybe Wyoming, Montana, where they would get the herd moving and stampeding, and eventually they would fall off this cliff, and hunters below would be there to kind of finish the job there. So, a lot of those major wildlife species went extinct before humans even had an idea of how big the world was, or what our role is in the world, or have any idea on how to protect them. All right, those are just early hunter gatherers trying to get a meal in there. Kind of one thing I always think is interesting to talk about here is what was the Americas like before 1492. Um, Obviously, that land is all the same, but the imaginary borders of tribes and all these kind of things um, have changed. So here's just a look at some of the major Native American tribes, the lands that they covered, and they had a huge culture and impact on the wildlife at the time as well. So that whole area is kind of its own thing. Um, this next era here is I like to call it pre-conservation history. So in the 1600s, that was when the pilgrims arrived. Wildlife as we know it today was plentiful, and it people could live off it. They could go hunting. They could use wildlife as a product After enough time of the Europeans arriving here, those wants turned into, I'm sorry, those needs turned into wants, and eventually we saw exploitation. So we saw heavy trapping here in the Minnesota region, selling those pelts, and people making lots of money off of wildlife. At the time, the Americas were a huge continent, and the thought that we could actually drive something to extinction was unheard of. By the 1800s, however, people began to see that need for conserving our natural resources. They began to see that, hey, there's a lot of species that are borderline. We're not seeing them anymore. They didn't have the term extinct then, but they were missing all these things. So 1800s, we start to see this need. Keep in mind what's going on in the United States in the 1800s, um, with the different land purchases as Lewis and Clark are making their way up the Missouri River out west. They're starting to realize these things, and it shouldn't come as a surprise to us. Here is a very very early photograph, actually from Minnesota, of a deer harvest. Now, before modern conservation laws existed, there were no seasons, there were no tags, there were none of no limits, none of that those kinds of things. So you could just go and harvest whenever and however many deer that you wanted to the point that the white-tailed deer was almost extinct in Minnesota. Their populations were so low they were almost unheard of. It's kind of hard to think about nowadays, as I have there's a doe and a couple fawns that live out just outside my window, I think. But that was not always the case here. You can see, this is almost for some people a lifetime of deer hunts, and it looks like just an afternoon for those two. Not that they didn't do anything wrong; they just that was before the times of needing a license or different seasons. Here's another famous case of these are a depiction of the passenger pigeon. Now, the passenger pigeon existed by the billions in eastern United States, but they were so easy to hunt that they would actually, these huge flocks, they would get shotguns out, or they would, huge nets, and it was a cheap source of meat. And they actually hunted them to extinction. There are no more passenger pigeons out in the world. Here's a look at some bison skulls. I think this is an iconic photo. Bison were another animal that thankfully they had enough hiding places out west that they could survive until we figured out that, hey, this is unsustainable what we're doing hunting wise. These would be ground up, usually probably as fertilizer, is what they did with the extra skulls. But we know the American bison used to number in the 50 million across the Great Plains, and they're stable today, but it's far from their peak population there. So what do we do? Um, at the time, there's a lot of talk and smart people trying to figure out. And kind of at the start of this conservation period, we see the founding of the first national park. Okay, the first national park in the world was Yellowstone National Park. If you haven't been out there, make sure you find some time in your life to go out and check out Yellowstone for its history and ecology. So it is the first national park in the world, and its purpose was to preserve the natural resources of the area. If you've ever been to Yellowstone, it is remarkable just how strange it is. It has more um, thermal geysers there than the rest of the world combined, and it was founded in 1872. Right, so 150 years ago, the Yellowstone is founded. It's located mainly in Wyoming, but also a little bit of Idaho and Montana, and it covers 3,500 square miles. So it's a huge area. It takes an hour or two to get to the other side of the park. And like I said, it's known for a variety of things. It's known for its wildlife. Here in the bottom left, it's got stable bison, elk, moose, wolf, grizzly bear, black bear, marmot, otter, beaver. All those populations are able to live there just fine. Um, This is part of my grad school program. There's me standing in front of a thermal vent there. That water was around, I think, around 198 degrees, something like that, and acidic too. It has the um, geological features, the rivers and the trout and all those things. And so for the last 150 years, we've kept this area fairly pristine. Now, if you've ever been, there's tons of crowds, there's tons of tourists. That's actually only a small portion of the park. The majority of the park, you can't, it's challenging for a human to access. You can't just drive your car to it as you're going. So that is the first national park in the world, the United States leading the way on that front. Following that up, there's a lot of national parks in the United States. Here's a map. Now, this also has national historic areas too, but the green are all the national parks. You can see they're obviously more out west than in the east. Once again, when 1872, a lot of the east had already settled for the most part, whereas the west was still wild. You guys, there's an assignment online. You guys are going to be doing some of your own research on um, national parks to educate us all on other preserved natural areas in the United States. So that's it for conservation part one. Starting tomorrow, we'll get a look into some more public lands and the different agencies that help run them.